Thank you, Sami. And we now move back to our paper speakers. Our second paper speaker in proposition tonight is Josh Matheson. Josh is a third-year history student of history and politics at St. John's College, and he won the right to speak tonight through open opposition. Josh, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, a few days ago, I was having a pre-exam results mental health day. I was in bed with popcorn, a tub of Ben & Jerry's, and I was watching the film Moana. And I have to say, Moana has a great deal to teach us about constitutional theory. For anyone who hasn't seen Moana before, it's a Disney film set in a Polynesian island society. The society lives according to the rules and traditions that were handed down by their ancestors. The island provided basically everything that they needed. The one rule was that nobody ever sail beyond the reef into the deeper ocean, and the rules served them well, so they followed them. But one day, things changed. The island was struck by blight and could no longer provide for the society. After generations of adhering to their ancestral traditions, the islanders decided that they would prefer to slowly starve to death than break the ancestral rule and find the solution beyond the reef. This is not dissimilar to the challenge that is currently facing the United States. The US Constitution is, for sure, an incredible document, but it has one fundamental weakness which has already been pointed out by members of this House today, and that is that it is impossible to change. This leaves America incredibly vulnerable to changing circumstances. The islanders were saved by Moana, who ignored the traditional rules and sailed off beyond the reef anyway. But the problem can't be so easily resolved for the United States. In normal times, Americans stick to the rules that are laid out by their own ancestors in their Constitution. In so doing, they paralyze the federal government and they embolden radical state governments to pass draconian laws. In times of crisis, the federal government is forced to ignore or evade the Constitution to prevent a catastrophe, and in so doing, they create a grave threat to the rule of law. And I'll come back to these points later, but I want to begin by emphasizing just how difficult it has become to change the Constitution. Today, there is clearly a desire to change the Constitution, but for some reason, it isn't happening. Since 1787, when the Constitution was drafted, members of Congress have formally proposed 11,000 amendments to the Constitution, and of those, 27 have actually been ratified. The US has not amended its Constitution, as has been pointed out, for over 30 years, and its most recent amendment, which was a pretty dry law just changing the way that members of Congress are paid, took 203 years between first being proposed and finally being ratified. When it takes that long, right? When it takes that long to implement the most tepid, technocratic change imaginable, the system is broken. Yeah, sure.
Do you not think it would take longer to push forward an amendment that is utterly irrelevant to the American people's lives and is completely technocratic, as opposed to something that has impetus behind it and has the will of the people behind it? Nobody cares about...
Sure. No, I'll come back to that point later, but one point I would point out is that among the amendments that have failed are the Child Labour Amendment, which you'd think people could get behind, right? The Equal Rights Amendment, which just says men and women are equal under the law. Those have both failed. If the impetus there is not enough, then I think maybe it's not about how dry the law is. The problem is the system. But I want to get back onto my other points. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is not normal. For context, France on average changes its constitution once every 3 years. Germany on average changes it almost every year. And the reason that America's constitution is so hard to change is not difficult. No, thank you. Antonin Scalia, right? Antonin Scalia, he was one of the most conservative Supreme Court justices who served on the Supreme Court, minus the sort of segregation ones. And he's probably among the strongest defenders of the Constitution to have ever lived. But even he believed that the Constitution had become too hard to change. He calculated that because of the vast differences between the populations in the most populous states and the least populous states, it would take the representatives of just 2% of the US population to block a constitutional amendment. And that's because to pass a constitutional amendment, you need 2/3 of politicians in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of all the state legislatures. When the founders wrote these rules, the US was a country of 4 million people in 13 states. The Constitution was written for a country, right, the size of modern-day Oman. But today it is a global superpower of 330 million people spread across 50 states, the entire width of the North American continent. The rules mean that the most radical, unhinged 2% of the country are granted a constitutional veto over the other 98%. And just to back this up, I did some research. Into how extreme a view has to be held by just 2% of Americans. And I actually couldn't find one. But what I did find was that 17% of Americans believe that politics and the media are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping elites who run a child sex ring. That 19... no, thank you. I'm scared to hear what that point of information was. Right, so 19% of Americans believe the COVID vaccine is a government plot to microchip people, and 23% of Americans sincerely believe that the US will be a communist dictatorship within 10 years. Considering this, right, is it any wonder that pretty basic, uncontroversial amendments, like the ones that I mentioned earlier, the child labour amendment and the equal rights amendment, can't pass, no matter the impetus behind them? Is it any wonder when the Constitution allows the most backwards, bigoted 2% of the country to veto any constitutional changes whatsoever, that it takes a civil war and 60 years of segregation before African Americans have their rights protected under the Constitution? And is it any wonder that women still don't? The fact that the Constitution can't change doesn't just threaten the freedoms of minority groups. It threatens every American's freedom. I'll begin with the threat that comes from state governments. When the founders created the US Constitution, their greatest fear was that they might accidentally create a new tyrannical government. So they put in place checks and balances that mean they can all block whatever the other one is doing. And these checks and balances have been pretty successful at preventing federal tyranny. But they've clearly gone too far. No, thank you. The US has developed a constitutional culture in which every new obstacle to effective government is celebrated. It's produced a situation where the US government is in a near constant state of paralysis. They lurch from government shutdowns to debt defaults to filibuster votes and achieve nothing in the process. This has created space for a new danger from state governments. The 10th Amendment reserves any powers not given to the federal government for the states, and the states have taken full advantage of it. So much so that when John Stuart Mill wrote on Liberty about invasive, nannying government overreach, his examples were not coming from Europe. They were coming from the state governments in the supposed land of the free. No, thank you. Many of these invasive laws are deeply sinister. The minute that the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, a swath of US state governments imposed draconian abortion bans. 6 imposed abortion bans with no exceptions, regardless of the health of the mother. 14 imposed bans with no exceptions, even in cases of rape and incest. And that doesn't look like protecting individual liberty to me. And Florida is among these states. Florida's abortion ban is so extreme that Donald Trump said that the law was a terrible thing and a terrible mistake. Florida's governor also passed a Don't Say Gay law, which prohibits any discussion of sexual orientation or gender at any point in schools. And when Disney resisted that law and criticised it publicly, the governor imposed punitive tax measures to silence them. No, thank you. If the federal government started policing speech and then punitively taxing anyone who dissented, Americans would rightly be incensed that their constitutional rights were being violated. But the Constitution doesn't really offer much protection against state governments. It gives them free rein to tyrannize over their citizens. So that's what happens in normal times. In times of crisis, things are different. From time to time, the US faces an extreme crisis which can only be resolved by the federal government. Think about the Great Depression or 9/11 or the global financial crisis. In these cases, the best efforts of the Wyoming House of Representatives probably isn't going to cut it. So the federal government needs to step in. But just because the federal government needs to act doesn't mean they always have the constitutional powers to do so. Nonetheless, in these cases, politicians probably rightly make the calculation that ignoring the Constitution to prevent a social or economic catastrophe is a worthwhile trade-off, so that's what they do. There are so many examples of this. FDR, during the Great Depression, he needed to, solve that, so he passed a series of laws. The Supreme Court struck down every single one of them, so he threatened to pack the court until they agreed, which they did. So that's striking down the checks and balances that the founders had deliberately put in place. Another and more recent example of this was after 9/11. President Bush believed that he needed to respond to this new national security threat, so he did. But he did so with powers that the founding fathers clearly didn't intend for him to exercise. Most egregiously among these was the use of Guantanamo Bay as a prison. It was, according to Amnesty International, specifically designed to evade the rule of law. Almost 1,000 people suspected of links to terror groups were imprisoned there indefinitely without trial. In 2004, the Supreme Court explicitly ruled that despite the fact it was in Cuba, it didn't matter. They were still entitled to Fifth Amendment due process. Didn't matter. The federal government viewed it as necessary to retain the facility on national security grounds, so they did. Only 10 detainees were even charged, right? Only 10. And the UN this year ruled that, issued a report saying that those who are still there continue to endure cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. In times of crisis, when the federal government doesn't have the powers to act as it thinks it needs to, it will do it anyway and just ignore the Constitution. That is not a Constitution which works effectively. In the Declaration of Independence, it says that men have inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and, quote, whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And understandably, given the context, revolution, More attention is being paid to the abolish part. But we need to draw attention to the alter part. It wasn't a mistake to put it there. The US Constitution was never meant to become static. The founders knew how dangerous that was. The founders knew that a constitution which cannot be changed is a constitution which is fundamentally unfit for purpose. Thank you.